Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to offer for a moment or two what we're going to be talking about this week, and then I will turn things briefly over to my partner in crime, Grace Leatherman, to talk a little bit about the proceedings of today. But just to remind people who are here, we're going to be talking about conspiracy theories this week. And as always, I'm going to look back to the past, talk a little bit about how this worked in the past, and then pivot to the present and talk a little bit about how conspiracy theories work and the kinds of times that seem to favor conspiracy theories, to maybe put some of what we're seeing now in a deeper historical context. But before I plunge in, I will turn things over to Grace, who will offer instructions for those who might be new about how to ask questions at the end after I've given you my historical spiel.
Yes, well, thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Grace Leatherman. I'm the Executive Director of the National Council for History Education. We're delighted you can join us, and thank you again, Joanne. We love doing this every week. If you do have questions for Joanne, please put them in the Q&A section. That's down at the bottom of your screen if you hover your mouse over, and that's where I'll be looking for questions. Do, of course, also feel free to participate in the chat. If you could generally keep your questions in chats historical in nature and family friendly, because we have lots of folks tuning in, so just do keep that in mind. And if you enjoy this programming, do check out NCHE.net, National Council for History Education, NCHE.net. We do have lots of programming, and especially coming up, we're going to be having some programming in July and August called Critical Conversations, and it'll be conversations on race, ethnicity, and history, because we're hearing from teachers and educators of all kinds that's something they just want to talk more about. So we will be having that programming, and that will culminate in a summit in August. So just keep an eye on that, and you can also become a member of NCHE at nche.net. But we just hope you join us for more wonderful programming like this. So thanks, Joanne. I'm going to go ahead and put the spotlight on you.
Okay. Okay, so conspiracy theories. As you're going to see, I'm moving my cursor there. Okay, as you're going to see, there's a deep history to conspiracy theories in American history. I'm going to go into that after I've talked a little bit about the kind of theories that I've highlighted online with primary sources. Those of you who've looked at them, and I apologize in advance for the size of the font. I know we can all make the font bigger on our computers. This is from a database of 19th century newspapers, and I did my best. Even I was becoming crotchety at trying to read, what was on there. So I apologize, and also my screen captures are probably less than ideal. However, I did go into a database looking for what I wanted to talk about today, so I get 2 points for that. Okay, so we're going to be talking about conspiracy theories that were flying around in the 1850s, but really 1854, 1855, 1856, ultimately caused by, if not all about, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the 2-second background to what we're going to be talking about here is, for a very long time, the Missouri Compromise, a lot of you I'm sure know this history, which all the way back to 1820 had essentially drawn a line across the nation, slavery in one part of the nation, free states on the other, in the other part of the nation, and that had sort of reigned supreme for a time. The nation was still spreading, states were still forming, there was a constant struggle to balance free states and slave states, and then in the mid-1850s you get what comes to be known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, in which suddenly, rather than having a line across the country, it's proposed that states that want to become states, that their constituents or their people living there have the right of popular sovereignty to decide whether they want to be free or slave states. And obviously that was enormously upsetting on a lot of levels. Those of you who've looked at the last book I wrote, which kind of uses one clerk from New Hampshire as a narrator, his diary is great on this, because in his diary he talks about, what is this? Like, it's been fine all along. Why are they upsetting this? What does it mean? And you can see in his diary, he begins to say, this is a plot. The slaveocracy is plotting. And he's someone who, is a clerk in Congress. So it's not like he's far away and like putting together strange conspiracies. He's sitting in Congress every day, or in and around Congress when he's no longer the clerk, but still, he's smack in the middle engaged with and socializing with members of Congress, and he still gets to this point of, why would they upset something like this? There must be a conspiracy. So that's the kind of thinking that I'm plugging into this week with the ultimately 3 newspaper clippings that I put up. 2 of them are really centered on conspiracy. One of them has conspiracy within it, but I put it up partly because it just shows you a fight or a potential fight being put in conspiracy context. And I wanted you to have the experience of seeing what one of these fights looks like in the newspaper. Now, 2 of the things that I posted are from the New York Tribune, which is founded in the 1840s, but with the birth of the Republican Party in the mid-1850s, it joins that side. It was always kind of a reformer. Horace Greeley, the editor, was kind of reformer-spirited newspaper, but it really takes on the fight against slavery when it joins the Republican Party, as you can see by looking at the things that were posted within it. So 2 of the obviously Northern-centric clippings that I posted are from the Tribune. Then there's one that's titled, I think, An Appeal to the South, which is from the Richmond Whig. Obviously the other side, a different kind of conspiracy that they're proposing, but still, they're representative. They're not comprehensive as far as all of the conspiracy thinking going on at the time, but they do represent the sort of 2 major lumps of conspiracy thinking that were going on in the mid and then ultimately late 1850s. And on the northern side, and you've probably heard, or many of you have probably heard the phrase slave power, right? Or slaveocracy. There was a sense that the slave power, sort of had managed to put itself in control of the government and was doing whatever it could do, valid and legitimate and legal or not, to spread its rule across the United States. And then, of course, the Southerners were looking at Northerners and saying, well, they were fanatics. That was their favorite term. Fanatics were trying to undermine or subvert the government if they didn't get what they want. What's interesting about this thinking, and what was interesting to me when I was writing, so there's a whole chapter in my most recent book about conspiracy theories. What was interesting to me in writing it, and you probably are thinking about this, even as I'm talking about the conspiracies now, there's truth. There's some truth in conspiracy theories, right? So even as I'm saying, oh, the South was trying to take over the government and spread slavery, well, that's not entirely wrong. Nor is it entirely wrong to say the North was desperately trying to stop that spread, or that there were some in the North that were willing to go to extreme measures to stop the spread of slavery. So there's elements of truth. And when I was writing about it, I was constantly stopping and asking myself, truth or conspiracy? Truth or conspiracy? And I was trying hard to draw that line, and it was hard to do. And the very fact that I, the historian with the distance of time, could look at this evidence, stand back and look at lots of evidence, and still have a little bit of trouble discerning truth from theory, tells you something, right? So I want to have clips. I once again do not have the newspaper in front of me, but I did have clips here. I wanted to read you just a little bit from the Tribune article that's titled "The Rising Cloud," right? Rising cloud, which tells you already the rising cloud, like something is happening. I just wanted to read you a bit from the middle of it. It says, "There are deep laid plots of treason to freedom consummating in Washington. The arch disunionist Jefferson Davis aspires to the post of Commander-in-Chief of the Army. Should he achieve his object, all that we know of his antecedents leads us to believe that he would not hesitate to use his influence to spread slavery into the West and North at the point of the bayonet, and if attempts were made to resist in any effective manner, he would exert all his power to subvert the government. The free states are surrounded by plots and toils and complications in respect to the subjugation of this government by the slaveholders, of which the people little dream." Okay, so hidden conspiracies. So here's the other side, which is the article titled "Appeal to the South." And it's lengthy, and in the part before this bit that I'm going to be reading to you, it suggests that the battle that's taking place, kind of like the Rising Cloud article suggests, this is not just of the moment, right? This is something longstanding and for all time, right? This is a momentous change. It's not some mere little thing happening in the present. So they quote this passage from the Tribune. And I should say about the Tribune, it was the largest daily newspaper in New York City. It had a tremendous influence. There were members of Congress who, when they wanted to have something that they were doing in Washington have an impact, would write to New York, would write to Greeley or other reporters for the Tribune and ask them to play it up in the Tribune, knowing it would reverberate back to Washington. So the Tribune was immensely powerful. But it also had some really radical reporters. And this passage that I'm going to read is one of those passages from a reporter that's somewhat radical, as you will hear. Okay, so in this Southern article from the Richmond Whig, they quote the Tribune saying, quote, "Better that confusion should ensue, better that discord should reign in the national councils, better that Congress should break up in wild disorder, nay, better that the Capitol itself should blaze by the torch of the incendiary or fall and bury all its inmates beneath its crumbling ruins, than that this perfidy and wrong should be finally accomplished." Okay, that's extreme, right? And that passage, I should say, when I was researching, those couple sentences, better that the Capitol should go down in flames and everyone inside of it should be buried, that was quoted a lot in a lot of Southern newspapers because it's so extreme, right? And if you're thinking along conspiracy lines that there's something happening out there and there are people with power operating behind the scenes to do it, and then you have in the major Northern newspaper a reporter essentially saying, yeah, let's bring it all down to ruins, you can see why that would have an impact. And it's interesting, in later years, when this reporter's name is Pike, when this reporter's, he published a collection of his writings and also other things that were happening in the time to kind of talk about this moment in the war, and he removes that passage, right? It's like, that was trouble, I'm taking it out. But at any rate, the Richmond Whig goes on to say, quote, "This is no fancy sketch, nor do we copy it into these columns to alarm any Southern man. It is the deliberate, foregone, long-cherished design of fanaticism here openly and boldly avowed. What fanaticism is capable of, the past can tell." So they're actually saying, you want to know what fanaticism can do? Look to history, right? And that word, it's the long-cherished, foregone, deliberate design, right? It's a plot. So what we're looking at there is, on the one hand, some truth, right? That Southerners are interested in maintaining their power in the Union, that they did have a disproportionate amount of power, partly because of the 3/5 compromise, but also within the government itself, partly, violence that I've written about was part of the way in which they maintained a grip on their power in the national government, along with a lot of other ways. But in one way or another, there was a slave power that was exerting itself. So it's not as though the Northerners who were afraid of that are making up crazy conspiracy theories, but the idea that there was a vast plot behind the scenes that had been in operation for a long time and people couldn't fathom the depths of it. You can actually see that in the Tribune article on the fight that I posted, right? It says something along the lines of, I don't have my notes on that here, but it says something about how Douglas was there in the House, clearly maneuvering his troops, and a congressman named Edmondson clearly was put on to cause trouble with the Northerners. Well, was there a vast plot with Douglas commanding his troops? I have no evidence of that. I mean, again, truth and conspiracy, sometimes there's a blurry line, and that is part of the power of conspiracy theories. But what we're looking at here is taking grains of truth, taking ways in which people with some power are threatening or frightening people who oppose those people with power. And then you get conspiracies, and you get essentially the equivalent of the deep state. A lot of these conspiracies are hatched in Washington. Newspapers in this period, partly because of things like the railroads and steam-powered printing presses and the telegraph, have more and more and more power and spread in this time period. So that helps too. But for all of these reasons, these conspiracy theories, this conspiracy thinking really takes hold. And I'm going to, in a moment, switch to talk about that generally, but, you can see how, given that there's some truth there, whatever small element, some conspiracy theories have very little truth, but sometimes they have a grain of it. You can see how hard it is to step in and say no, because someone could point to the grain of truth and say, well, see, yeah, it's very hard to smack down a conspiracy theory. And I think that's eternally true. I'm going to actually segue with that into talking a little bit more broadly about conspiracy theories and where they come from. As I suggested at the outset, there was actually a deep, long-standing American tradition of conspiracy thinking, and it's not just American, right? It's from everywhere. It goes all the way back in time. This is not a uniquely American thing. But if you look at the American context, you can point to things like the witchcraft trials, right? That there's Satan and has some cause that he's taking people over to spread his power, and it has to be tracked down, and it needs to be, you could plug that into this thinking during the prelude to the revolution and during the revolution itself, right? There's a lot of conspiracy thinking that there are evil ministers who are coaching, prodding the king to do things that he might not otherwise do. And there's, again, talk of this sort of deep behind the scenes high government policy to enslave the colonies. When the colonists begin to think that the king is in on the conspiracy, right, that he's part of this plot to enslave the colonies, things move to another level. But again, there's a level of conspiracy thinking that there's a plot and it's being hatched piece by piece. And only now are we realizing the plot, but now that we've realized the plot, we have to act. Some of conspiracy theory thinking comes from the fact that and this is actually, I read a bit of sociology for this morning. I believe he's a retired sociologist who taught for a while at Rutgers named Ted Goertzel. And he's talked a bit about the power behind conspiracy theories and when are they most likely to come about. And he writes, conspiracy theories are particularly likely when people feel that the social order is collapsing or, quote, the situation of the average person is getting worse. And he found in his study, which I thought was interesting, there was a positive correlation to positive responses to the question. So if people answered yes to this question, they were more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. And the question was, thinking about the next 12 months, how likely do you think it is that you will lose your job or be laid off? People who answered yes to that question were more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. So on the one hand, there's a logic to them. On the other hand, some of what conspiracy theories are doing is constructing a logic, enabling people to feel some claim or power over events that sometimes aren't a well-laid logical plot, but really are events unfolding in some kind of order. And there certainly are people pushing for what they want, but these theories pull things together in times when people feel that things are frayed. And there's a comfort in that, right? And there's a power in that, because once you feel that you have a theory that's valid and true, you can search for and find things to support it, however far-fetched that evidence is. And as I suggested before, it's very hard to act against that, because if you step forward and say, no, that's not true, or no, that's not real proof, then you're just part of the conspiracy. So it's tricky and it's powerful, but it's psychologically understandable, right? It's an attempt to take power and control over the narrative in a way that makes you feel better, in a sense, about events because you understand them, and that gives you the sense that perhaps there's something you can do now that you know the truth to prevent something bad from happening. So ultimately, conspiracy theories are theories about power, about people who are perceiving some kind of group or individual that seems to control everything, and you are perceiving the fact that they are controlling everything and are out to do something evil, and that then you must act against it. Some truth, not a lot of proof, and I believe this is Goertzel who says this, enormous leaps of logic, right? A little truth is not the same thing as logic. So all of this, I think, is true about conspiracy thinking. I think today, if you think about the deep state, if you think about fake news, that there's a plot in the press. I know that people are thinking about the fact that some secret laboratory created the COVID virus. I've seen floating around online, which is, you know, in and of itself, technology is helping spread these kinds of theories, that a vaccine, a COVID vaccine, is partly a plot somehow or other for Bill Gates to plant chips in people's brains. That I don't know. But at any rate, there are a lot of theories. You don't have to look very hard, particularly on Twitter, where people can just drop in and spread ideas around and drop out. You know, Facebook, for all of its problems, at least there's a little bit of a personal link between people who communicate with each other some of the time. Twitter really is just fast and furious and often anonymous. But there are all of these kinds of theories, and some of them are very fervently believed. And on occasion, you know, I've dipped into Twitter to try and say, really? Like, do you really think X is going to happen? If you think about it, if you really ask yourself that question, do you think that's happening? And one way or another, sometimes I will get, yes, can't you see it? Or I'll get someone pulling back and becoming a little quiet. The people pulling back and becoming a little quiet, to me, that's important, because when you're saying, I don't know if I believe this, prove it to me, show me. If that's hard to do, that means something, right? And one of the things that I do deliberately on Twitter is I engage with a lot of people who I do not agree with, and they do not agree with me. I like the idea that it is possible to have civil exchanges with people who I profoundly disagree with, that's possible. And that I can at least weigh in with what historical evidence suggests, and what evidence generally suggests. And I don't know if that has any influence at all, but in my little happy world of illusion, it makes me feel that I'm at least contributing to something. But what that means is I'm constantly engaging with a number of people who very fervently believe there's a vast conspiracy of some kind that's happening right now. And sometimes, you know, I'm part of it. The assumption is that I'm part of it until I say, really, am I part, you think I'm doing X? Like, really, you kind of know me a little bit. You know, you follow me on Twitter, I tweet too much, and you've probably been following me for a while. So do I seem like, you know, and they'll say, well, no. So, you know, I don't, very often when I'm talking about whatever I'm talking about on Thursday mornings, I'm highlighting something that we need to think about. I'm raising questions, asking you to take observations, to pause for a moment, to think, to ponder evidence. I'm not stepping forward with answers. I wish I were. And I don't know who has the magical answers at this moment, but one of the parts of those answers, one thing that we can do, and that applies in this case, as in many other things I've talked about, is to pause for a minute, step back, and ask yourself what it is. If you are feeling tempted, or if you are ready to believe that there's a vast conspiracy of some kind, and it's possible to believe that in any number of mindsets, to pause for a moment, think about what's being asserted, really ask yourself about the fundamental logic of it, see if you can find proof of it. And the same goes for if you're engaging with someone else who is convinced of a theory, a friend, a family member. These are fraught conversations, and I understand that some of them are impossible to have. But one way to at least broach a conversation is to at least ask people to pause for a moment, and rather than plunge in to the theory, to step back, to think about what it asserts, to ask questions, not like prove it, but what are you relying on? Like, what makes you think that? To really boil it down, because I think sometimes those kinds of questions, either for ourselves or in our conversations with other people, can at least, won't stop the rolling sort of power of conspiracy theories, but might disempower it a bit, might pause it a bit, might cause people to stop and consider. And I suppose week after week after week, in one way or another, I'm saying, let's look to the past, let's see how we look at the past, and then let's use those questions so that in the present, we pause to consider what's happening now and the ways in which what's happening now, this dynamic has happened before. Some of what we're seeing now is part of a power dynamic that has happened before. So rather than explode in a sense that, you know, what's happening now has never happened before, it's more useful to say, okay, there are things happening now, or a combination of things happening now that have not happened before. And we can, you know, it's possible for us to move towards progress or change in a way that will be positive and beneficial and that, you know, will make us feel good. I realize there's thousands of definitions of good. But at any rate, this is a moment when change is possible, and that's a good thing. And we should be aware of that. And we should think of it that way and not sit back and allow it to pass. On the other hand, it's a moment of change. And it's that kind of moment that breeds this kind of thinking. So rather than assuming that there actually are zillions of conspiracies happening, I suppose what I'm preaching this week, it's a non-sexy thing to preach. Pause and think about what you're thinking. Pause and help others think about what they're thinking, because this kind of thinking is a pattern. It's a symptom of something bigger. And although there are grains of truth in it, finding out the something bigger that's helping create this isn't going to necessarily solve the problem, but it might be helpful. So my thought in talking about conspiracy theories this week was that, which was, and I've said this before too, when I say pause, I mean to step back from the emotion of the moment, because there's a lot, I mean, for me, and I'm sure for most of you, there's a lot of emotion in this moment. And on a daily basis, I am not the world's most productive writer at this moment because I'm constantly thinking about a lot of other things. But when you're confronted by something that feels hyper alarming in some way, it's pause and think about what it is. And I've said this before, think about what the people offering this evidence or idea or thought want from you as a response. Is what you're looking at rhetoric or strategy, or is it evidence? Again, these are all blurry lines, which I acknowledge and which I experienced in trying to write about conspiracy theories. But there is no harm in pausing and stepping back from the furor of the moment and asking yourself smart questions. And I suppose as a historian, you know, that's what we do from the past. Of course, we bring our emotions when we write about history. I get a lot of what I write about is people whose strong emotions are driving them to be violent, right? That's what I write about. And I get emotionally involved with the people I write about. I always do. But when I'm trying to figure out the logic of what they're doing, I don't want that in the mix. I want to step back and look at their actions and look at the patterns and look at how they fit in that time and look at the culture of the time and look at how other people are acting and figure out the logic of that moment. So in a sense, it's that kind of historical thinking. We can't be entirely objective, but we can be thoughtful and ask smart questions. I think that applies particularly well to a moment when there's a lot of conspiracy thinking. Okay, I'm gonna pause, but this week I remembered to show the mug. So get your questions ready, but before we launch into that part of this, so I really was floundering this week in Mugland. I'm running out of mugs. So the mug I got, I will explain it after I show it to you. There is a connection. It's just not quite as apparent as some of the others. Okay, my mug this week is a Shakespearean mug. It is Shakespearean drama. And if there is a dramatist whose work is more founded on ideas of conspiracy and, you know, kings and people in power doing things behind the scenes, Shakespeare is like on the top 10, right? So this is my reach for the week. But you're gonna have to get used to some pretty big reaching. This one's a stretch, but it's a logical stretch. So this is my mug for the week. Shakespearean conspiracy theories as an explanation for the unfolding of history, right? Which is part of what he does, particularly in his history plays. Okay, I am going to stop there. Thank you. Nice mug connection. Right, Hamlet, thank you. Thank you. I feel much better. But at any rate, I'm going to open things up. We can now have a discussion and see what we want to talk about. So, okay. If you will pardon me for a minute, I'm going to put my air conditioner on because I'm actually beginning to die. Hang on, I'll be right back.
While she does that, because that is very important, please do put your questions in the Q&A section. It's a little easier to see and sift through than the chat, although we're seeing some great things in the chat. Thank you for that too. And if you are on Facebook, I'll check in there too, so do feel free to put questions for Joanne. As Matt says every week, you don't just want to hear my questions, although I have plenty. But we are getting some this is very important. And I think, Joanne, as you said, this is a very, I think, emotional time for everyone. And we're all feeling that. And all of us need that moment to step back and analyze primary sources. I like that we historians, that's how we solve problems. If there is a problem, we'll just analyze the sources and it'll be fine. But Angela on Facebook was saying that conspiracy theories very much are about comfort. And I think all of us are seeking comfort. So that is why it's particularly important to have this discussion now. So thank you for that. And for teachers, there are just so many resources out there to help teach students how to analyze documents, which carries over now, I think. Again, we talked about Stanford History Education Group and their, civic online reasoning. I know Maryland Public Television has things. The museum still has some stuff up, even though they don't exist anymore. But there's resources for you as educators to help students do this analysis. So let's take a look at some of these questions here. Joanne, Lisa wants to know if there's a correlation between conspiracy theories and scapegoating.
I mean, I suppose there's a correlation, but not causation. You know, I mean, scapegoating, I think, is broader, right? Scapegoating is, it's all his fault, which doesn't necessarily have to be bound up with some kind of theory of back channels. And, you know, it can just be, I know that that person's secret cause or desire is X. So it's the same impulse. And it can be part of, I think scapegoating can be part of a conspiracy theory, but I think scapegoating is broader and in a sense easier to cast around because it's one person, right? You can say, well, it's all that person's fault is an easy thing to say. And as we see all the time in social media land, it's easy for someone to say something and hard sometimes to refute it.
Thank you. And that idea of social media land comes into the next question as well. That you've talked a lot about newspapers, Joanne, and how while newspapers do require reading and writing, there were also large groups of people who were being read to. So in fact, newspapers were disseminating even to groups that were not necessarily literate. But we do have a question about just the ease of transmission of conspiracy theories. Are conspiracy theories more dangerous today with Facebook and Twitter and just the access to that? Could you compare that to conspiracy theories in an age when there was just newspapers?
Well, I think technology can boost conspiracy theories. Yeah, I think you know, in the not yet the United States, in the colonies and then United States in the late 18th century, newspapers were spreading. You know, people who looked at the United States considered it a newspapering country. Sure, that although people were being read to, still there was a spread. News and ideas were spreading in newspapers to a degree with a speed and with a reach that was ever increasing. You know, the period that I was just writing about is the telegraph is coming into play. And not only is news spreading more quickly and has a broader reach, but people seeing this news don't necessarily have a link with anyone else who's seeing what's happening. So in other words, if it's a game of telephone as far as the information goes, you could be pretty far along the chain. I remember the member of the Senate who isn't one of the members of the Senate who's insulted by Charles Sumner, and when Sumner gives his speech that results in Preston Brooks caning him, the senator stands up and someone basically says, this isn't worth getting so upset about. And this fellow says, but people are going to be reading this all over the country and they don't know me. So they're not going to know it's not true, which feels on the one hand so much something of an older time, right? It's almost like this, he's an older person looking back and he's like, well, if people don't know me, they're going to believe this. It's a kind of poignant thing to think. It's also, I suppose, correct, but you're not going to stand in the way. of the spread of news and knowledge when technology is there to help you do it. So yeah, I think and so to get right back to your question, social media is part of that chain. You know, I think first cell phones were that people could, you know, and they still are, that people can witness things. We're seeing that. I mean, that's an enormous part of the question of race right now, is that white people now have seen in some ways that they haven't before through people capturing on cameras what has been going on for a long time. That's some of the dynamic of now, but I think social media also. You know, I spend too much time on social media. I acknowledge it to you, the people who are here with me this week. But I, even as a thoughtful user of social media, I have to stop every once in a while, partly because I'm sometimes stunned at what some people are thinking as far as conspiracy theories. Sometimes because I see someone say something and as I suggested to you, I have to stop for a minute and think, wait, really? Because some little part of me is like, ha! And, you know, the ha moment is a moment when you need to pause and step back and think about what you're concluding before you conclude it. So yeah, I think in all the ways that new technologies are positive, connect the world, spread information, free people up, give some people access to things they didn't have access to before, there are also dangers and threats. It's a little bit of a Wild West moment that we're in as far as social media, and a little bit even still with the internet as far as to how you corral it and how you deal with some of the openings and vulnerabilities that it's caused, and how do we as consumers grapple with that?
Thank you. This is, I think, something all of us are thinking about, especially looking at the chat and looking at the questions. So thank you for addressing that. We've got all kinds of great questions coming in. Let's see, so many.
This is good.
I'm trying to do my best with all this. Thank you all, and I apologize if I don't get to all of them. So here's an interesting one. This is from James. Modern popular culture connects conspiracy theories of early American history with Freemasons. Many of the individuals in the government, including French, were Freemasons. Did non-Masons have concerns or thoughts about men in a secret society holding positions of power? Is that something people talked about?
The anti-Masonic party. I mean, yes. So the short answer is you're right on target. As a matter of fact, I had a list. I didn't go into it, but I had a list, and it was like Masons, Mormons, Catholics. There are any number of groups that appear to people to have some secret connections, you know, the Pope, or like secret ceremonies, whatever it was. There was a lot of suspicion. The Masons particularly, because they were a secret society. They had secret handshakes and secret things that they were doing. There were a lot of them in the government. So yeah, people discussed it. It becomes a bigger issue in the early 19th century when you do get the rise of the anti-Masonic party, which pretty much tells you what it is, but it's grounded in this idea that there's something dangerous and secretive happening that needs to be confronted. You know, before that point, in the late 18th century, you have the Bavarian Illuminati, right? Which is this idea that comes about that there's a European secret group spreading to American shores to spread its evil logic. You know, we have to fight the Illuminati. People still use the word Illuminati now as kind of a joke, right? Fight the Illuminati.
They're using it in the chat right now. Yes.
Right, exactly. So the Illuminati is the 1790s is when that first comes about and people buy right into that. And if you go into a newspaper database and search for Illuminati, you will find it there. But that's where, you know, that's the moment when it becomes a big deal in the new United States.
Great.
Oh, there I see. Let's not forget the Bavarian Illuminati. Yes.
Yep. Yep. So another time period. Aaron says, no nothingism comes to mind. I'm thinking of the 1850s could be taught through the explicit lens of a decade of conspiracy theories. I teach high schoolers who are always looking for an answer to so what. I've fallen back on this period. This is a period whose events most directly lead to the Civil War, but might conspiracy theories be a valid organizing principle for connecting students more directly to this period?
Yeah, well, I think conspiracy theories and even more broadly than that, and the Know Nothings is a great example of this, right? So the Know Nothings are an anti-immigrant anti-Catholic. I mean, they're plugging into this idea that there's foreigners of various sorts coming in and trying to take over America, and they need to be fought. And they're initially at least secretive, and in some of their meetings, they plug into that kind of behavior. But they're also plugged into the party system to some degree. So I would say conspiracy theories are a useful way to get at how some people are thinking, but I think you almost have to knock that up a level and talk with your students about the ways in which people are drawing conclusions, the logic, the ways in which they're constructing narratives of how things work. Some of those might fit into the conspiracy theory category because they'll be like, there's like a big plot. Some of them are just going to be people trying to figure out the logic of the moment and coming up with an idea. Not really a conspiracy, but I would say enabling students to understand, for example, why someone would become a know-nothing and what it means. As a matter of fact, my good old narrator of my last book, Benjamin Brown French, amazing diary. I thank you, Benjamin Brown French. I always thank Benjamin Brown. And he briefly is a know-nothing. And he becomes a know-nothing because to him it represents something very American initially. He's like, I'm joining the American party. I'm you know, it's fine because it's defending America. And then he discovers how much of it is about anti-immigrants and anti-Catholicism, and he jumps out. And he says very cryptically in his diary, well, I did for a while act with them, but then I stopped when I discovered what they really were. So there's a great example of someone who bought into an idea but wasn't really interested in the big conspiracy. But I think, I mean, this is what I do in my kind of history all the time, right? Is to look at something that is seemingly illogical. Dueling is a prime example of this, and then try to figure out how it makes sense to people at the time. So if you have someone joining the know-nothing, you know, going in with them politically, they've taken an act, which means on some level they believe in that, even though to us we might say, really? Why would you do that if before you were a Democrat? Our job as historians and historical thinkers is to say, okay, how did that make sense? Sometimes you can't get to that. Sometimes it's personal or specific, but often you can think on a broader level about why people generally made one kind of choice. And that's going to tell you something about how people are processing information, how they're thinking, what kinds of conclusions they're drawing. And that becomes an aid in your trying to understand the mental landscape of the people that you're writing about or studying.
I think that's so important to do that when we're talking to students about different eras. John says, it would seem the secrecy rules during the Constitutional Convention would make it ripe for conspiracy theories. Was that part of the anti-federalist argument?
Interesting.
Or was that just common for the time, that level of secrecy?
Well, a little, I mean, I don't think it created a vast conspiracy thinking mode, but, you know, there were comments like, I think it's Patrick Henry who looks at what's going on and says, I smell a rat. Like, you know, I don't know what's going on in there, but I don't like it. Now, the reason that one of the reasons why the Constitutional Convention was kept behind closed doors was because only then would people in that room feel free to say exactly what they thought. Because if the public had access to what was going on there, everyone would hide their thoughts because they would be taken in all kinds of directions and people would draw all kinds of conclusions. So actually, you know, they given a choice between being transparent and hiding everything, hiding kind of was the only way that they felt they could have the open kind of discussion that would enable people to really explore options and come to conclusions. Hamilton is really funny on this front because he goes to extremes. You know, he's extreme in his politics in many ways. And during the Constitutional Convention, he talks about having a president elected for life during good behavior. And, you know, he goes off in his happy direction of really wanting a centralized government. Years later, that begins to come out and people start saying, we know you're a monarchist because we have proof. And there's this really comical letter that Hamilton writes, I want to say in like 1801 or 1802. And it's like, you know, that convention was secret because we were supposed to be allowed to toss around ideas freely without any consequences. So this isn't fair. He's like, this isn't the rules under which we were operating. So in a sense, he's kind of suggesting we were right to keep it secret, but because it was secret, sure, everybody wanted to know what was happening, and people who were suspicious of ideas about really strengthening the government, sure, they were suspicious about what was going on in the convention.
Great. Again, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section. It's a little easier to see than the chat. We are getting some great questions here. Do keep them as much as possible. We're a history show, but we know that there are connections to modern day events. These are things we're all thinking about today, and it's an important conversation to have. So do put those questions in that Q&A or on Facebook. We are seeing a little bit of, some folks are watching on Facebook, which is nice. And I appreciate Brandy's comment that conspiracy theories are combated by quality history education in P through 12 classrooms. Thank you, Brandy. We agree. That's why we're here.
Well, I'll reiterate that. That's an important point, because some of what we teach as teachers of history is the careful consideration of evidence. Where does it come from? What is it saying? The same ways in which in my classroom, if a student writes a paper and they cite something from some random website as evidence, it's in a history class that you could say to a student, why did you believe that? Like, who said that? Why does that person know? And when you ask a few questions like that, it becomes clear, well, I always refer to those kinds of sites as Joe in his garage. Why are you quoting Joe in his garage to me in your paper? Like, find someone credible. Go to the Library of Congress. Go to, I don't care what Joe thinks. Go somewhere else. But yeah, those are the skills that are important and that we teach. One of many ways in which the teaching of history right now is really, really important. And someone mentioned Hofstadter and the paranoid style. Yeah, that's like a key text. Richard Hofstadter wrote the paranoid style. I think it's the paranoid style of American politics. I'm going to get the title wrong, but that is written, I think, in 1964 as an essay. Launches very specific ways of thinking about this as a style of American politics.
And we did have another question just about strategies for having these discussions, because you talked about how with students, asking them to find those legitimate texts, and I think someone noted in their question that sometimes there are people in our lives who have difficulty slowing down or who are resistant to the idea of looking at those sources. Is that something you'd recommend even for a family member or a friend as well? Just asking questions about sources. They just wanted you to expand a little bit more about those strategies of how we encourage people to look at sources, both historically and modern.
Paranoid style of American history. Thank you, Gloria. I'm bad with titles. I'm good with documents, not so good with titles. So talking to family members, that's tricky. I'm not going to pretend to have a brilliant answer for that. I would say on the most basic level, asking family members to explain precisely why they think what they think is going to be useful. You might not, depending on you and the family member and your relationship, who knows? But it could be useful, at least for you to understand how that person is thinking. I have a family member who I ultimately chose not to talk about politics with because, and even as a historian, and this was, someone in my larger family who respected the fact that I was a historian, was proud of me as a historian, but really believed what this person believed. So I found out sort of where this person was getting their thinking from. We had a brief conversation. I saw that this was not going to be a useful conversation. And so I just stopped talking about politics with this person. I don't think that's the best solution, but I think families are complicated. So I think that's to each his own in figuring things out. But if there's a way to at least ask questions in a calm way, and maybe you can exchange why each of you believe, if you're calm enough and able to do that on both sides, why you believe what you believe, like what do you bring to it? But I don't know how possible that is for a lot of people. I found it hard, and I was sitting there with evidence and ready to, but look, and I couldn't do that.
Teaching students document analysis is different than hanging out with
Oh,
your
here we
guys. I
go.
think we know
Paranoid
that.
Style in American Politics, published 1964.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember reading that and thinking, I'm really in grad school now.
Well, you know, I went back to it when I was writing about conspiracy theories. I read about the slave power and all that, but I went all the way back to Hofstadter just to understand the sort of gut punch reality of conspiracy thinking.
And Claudia took note, you mentioned that you did a little bit of looking at psychological studies. She wondered if there was a name of a book that you came across in preparing for today, or an author that particularly caught your eye. We know that you're not.
Yeah, this is not my field. I mean, I saw
we know it's not your field. It's not a fair question. But if you'd seen something in preparing for today, Claudia is interested.
Yeah, well, the thing that or the scholar who I found particularly on target for me as a sociologist, I mentioned his name briefly. It's Ted Goertzel, Goertzel, who wrote a lot about conspiracy thinking. He was cited in a number of other works, which is why I kind of took his name and went looking for him. You know, if you go to Google Books and search on conspiracy theories, the first things that come up are like big, broad studies of conspiracy theories, encyclopedias of conspiracy theories. And if you look at those, they will give you big names. Obviously, Hofstadter is there all over the place, but I wouldn't have come up with Goertzel's name if it weren't for my looking at broader studies and looking around. And, you know, that's where he very bluntly said, you know, the social order is collapsing. The study about if people think they might be unemployed in the next 12 months, they're more likely to believe in conspiracies. That was where I found this information, and I found that really compelling. He used the word anomia, anomia, which is not one I had come across before, which apparently means the feeling that the social order is collapsing. So, and I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it, but at any rate, that's the person who I was digging around in, but I was digging around on the basis of the fact that it was cited by others and seemed interesting, and very well, there could be other things that are better than that.
And I'm sure to our audience, if there are things that you read when learning about this, please feel free to put them in the chat and share. We're certainly very interested in.
Oh, there we go. Look at that. Anomia from Emil Durkheim. You guys.
They like books.
Yeah, I love you guys.
We have just a few minutes left, but again, if you do have a last minute question, put it in the Q&A there. I'm just going to take a quick check on Facebook here and see if we have any more questions. Let's see. We did have a question here, Joanne. Just if what role is played by anti-British and anti-French conspiracy theories in the 1790s and 1810s? Is that something you'd be able to talk about?
I can certainly talk. I mean, it's a big topic, but
yes.
The French, conspiracy theories about the French trying to control American politics in the mid to late 1790s was certainly a thing. And there was a belief that the French were trying to secretly control elections, and that they had, you know, spies in the country, that they wanted Jefferson for president. This is the 1796 election, and that they were trying somehow or other to affect the election to favor Jefferson, like, oh no, foreign interference in elections. So that was the first real election in American history, the first time that we don't have George Washington, and poof, we have threats about, or conspiracies about foreign influence. Now again, the French did have a person they wanted. The French were engaged in American politics. So as always, you can't say harumph, harumph, there can't be any truth to that. It's blurry, you know, but certainly that was a moment in which the Federalists particularly were convinced that the French had some kind of, you know, plot going to take things over, and that there were Republicans who were going to help them with that, and Republican newspapers. You know, the Alien and Sedition Acts are a response to many things, and one of the things that they're a response to on the part of the Federalists is this desire to cut off networks of Republican communication, to have a hold on foreigners who are, you know, immigrants who are in the United States, to sort of get control of what they felt was, in their mind, a brewing dangerous situation, in which somehow the French Revolution was going to spread, and its ideas were going to come and disrupt American society, and that there was a plot to make that happen.
Thank you. That's fascinating stuff. This is actually a question from me, but are there incidents where at the time people sort of said, oh, it's a conspiracy theory, and turned out to be the real deal?
Oh, were there sometimes conspiracies?
Because we do have some folks mentioning in the chat that sometimes it's hard for them to not, when they see something that's only being reported in one source, or that may be coming from a group that's marginalized, and it's hard to avoid conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Is there a time when conspiracy theories have turned out to be the real deal? And if you don't know, or I don't have an example, that's
Well,
fine. This is my last question.
Yeah, well, yeah. Right now, I can't pick a specific one, although the general answer is yeah, sometimes there really are conspiracies, right? That are actual conspiracies. In the very same way that conspiracy theories have a grain of truth, there's also the fact that sometimes there actually are conspiracies, right? An equivalent to that is when I was working initially, some of my initial work on Hamilton, when people, scholars, didn't understand what Hamilton was doing, they would sometimes say something along the lines of, well, he had a temporary emotional lapse, or he was suddenly irrational. You know, he wasn't thinking clearly and thus did this. And my thought was, really? Like, you're going to explain this by making up an idea that somehow, when if you ask questions, you can decide whether there's a reason or not? In the case of Hamilton, what I found was, no, he's reasoning his way in. It's stupid reasoning, but he's reasoning his way in. So it's another way of saying, are there sometimes conspiracies? Yeah, but before you buy into one, you better ask a lot of questions and not take assumptions for granted. Like, well, that's a dumb decision. He must have been bonkers. That's an easy conclusion. That's an easy out. So things that seem obvious and appear to explain things in weird kinds of ways, I guess that's the theme for this week. Ask questions, right? Ask questions. Evaluate evidence. Ask questions of your evidence, and don't allow your emotion to carry you away before you really consider what it is you're thinking and what it is you're concluding.
Calm, logical thinking, going to the sources.
Yes, yes.
Wonderful. Well, we got lots. Test your theories. Lots more things going on in the chat. So I think it is about 11 o'clock. Is this about the time I think we'll officially wrap up? But then if folks would like to stay around and chat with Joanne, we'll be here. Does that sound good to you, Joanne?
Those who want to stick around, the after party will be unrecorded after party. With all the conspiracy happening, will be happening now.
Do feel free to hang out with us. And if you are on Facebook and you want to switch to the webinar and just hang out for a bit, you can go to nche.net, and Joanne's face is right on the front of our website. You can click conversations and join us that way. But again, this is Joanne Freeman is here with us, and I'm Grace Leatherman with NCHE, and we're just so grateful Joanne could join us today. And do join us again next week for. Yes, please go ahead, Joanne.
I just want to thank you guys for joining in again. And as Grace is saying, come back next week. As always, I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to talk about, but I will have decided a few days before, and ideally I will have a mug. But just as Grace is saying, thank you all so much for coming and working through these ideas as a group.
As we know, history matters, and so does coffee.
History matters.
All right. I'm going to click off the record, and do feel free to hang out with us if you'd like.
Okay. Yay.